Arthur William Upfield was born on the 1st of September 1890 in Hampshire, England, before being sent to Australia by his father in 1911 after failing real estate examinations. Arthur joined the 1st Australian Imperial Force at the outbreak of World War I, sailing eventually to Egypt, where he met his wife, an Australian nurse named Douglas, whom he married in 1915. He was discharged from his duties in England in 1919, and shortly afterwards, the couple welcomed a son named James Arthur Upfield, who was born in February 1920. After James was born, the family returned to Australia, where Arthur gained employment in the outback. Arthur was employed by the Rabbit Department as a government boundary rider from October 1st, 1928 to September 15th, 1931. On the rabbit-proof fence in Merchant, Western Australia, the fence itself measuring around 113.30 meters long. From May the 18th, 1929 to June 16th, 1929, Upfield was stationed at the Dromedar Camel Station with a man named George Ritchie, who was permanently stationed there. Upfield came to the station once a month from the south, and a second boundary rider, Lancelot Madison, came from the north at more irregular intervals. A station contractor named James R. would also join them by this point. Arthur had already written 3 detective novels, however. While working on the rabbit-proof fence, he decided to write his next book. The Sands of Wendy. Unlike his previous works, this novel would feature no body for the fictional detective to find. This presented significant challenge for Arthur, who struggled to devise a method to dispose of the murder victim's body. In search of a solution, he voiced his problem to his colleague, George Ritchie. George eventually managed to conjure up a method which involved luring the victim out into the bush before shooting them dead, then burning the bodies along with some kangaroos in order to divert suspicion. The next step would involve sifting any metal fragments from the ashes of the fire before dissolving them in acid, crushing the remaining bone fragments into dust before blowing them into the wind. Arthur liked George's plot, but unfortunately for the detective in his novel, there was no way for him to prove that the murder had taken place. George had seemingly come up with a perfect murder plot, leaving no evidence behind. As a result, Arthur was once again stumped. He offered £1 to George to find a flaw in his method, but he couldn't. Even Upfield, other colleagues at the fence, and even in Perth, couldn't find any flaws in this method. While working in the outback, it was uncommon for the men at the Camel Station to encounter many other people. Such meetings were very rare, however. In late 1928, a 27-year-old stockman named Snowy Rolls arrived at the Camel Station on his motorbike, searching for employment. Arthur Upfield was already acquainted with Snowy Rolls, having met him about 2 years earlier at the Nari Out camp, where he was stationed. In his book, The Murchison Murders, Arthur describes Snowy as, quote, a well-proportioned man, fair-haired, blue-eyed, clean-shaven, neat in dress, and from the feminine standpoint better looking than the average. Snowy was noted as being a hard worker and excellent horse rider, and enjoyed pranking the other men at the Camel Station. He was very engaging, and even got the others involved in betting some nights. Snowy Rolls was certainly well liked amongst his colleagues. On the evening of the 6th of October, 1929, there was a gathering of men at the homestead at the Camel Station, including Arthur Upfield, K. George Ritchie, the inspector's son, David Coleman, the northern boundary rider, Lance Madison, and Snow Rolls. It was during this night where the men discussed the murder plot of Upfield book in greater detail, more specifically about how to dispose of a body without leaving any trace of evidence. Upfield had spoken to all of the men previously for help, in regards to his plot hole, including Snowy Rolls, whom George Ritchie had also discussed the murder plot with the plot of Arthur as novel eventually fell into place after a few weeks of writer's blog. He realized whilst tending to a camel named Curly that he could use George Ritchie's entire plot, but the murderer could leave something behind for the book's inspector to find. And with that Upfield, this book, The Sands of Wendy, was complete. Meanwhile, on December 7th, 1929, the irregular James Ryan, a 45-year-old from Kalgoorlie, was out working near the Chow Boer camp, but had not returned, so Snowy Rolls decided to venture down the tracks to pick him up. As it turned out, Snowy's car broke down near to the 100 peg, so he took James Ryan and another laborer, 32-year-old Southern Australian George Henry Lloyd, back to the Camel Station homestead for the night. Ryan sang and Lloyd played his accordion. The following morning, December 8th, Ryan and Lloyd, along with Snowy Rolls, headed back to their camp to the west after bringing back Snowy's broken-down car, which was then abandoned in a shed. According to Arthur Upfield, this was the last time that he saw James Ryan and George Lloyd alive. A few days later, upon returning to the Hamel station after manning the rabbit fence, George Ritchie told Upfield that he had spoken to a prospector named James Yates, who had been camping in the area, who told him that he had seen Snowy driving a vehicle alone along the alternate route to the North Track via Watson's Well by the Vermin Fence, rather than traveling through the Camel Station as normal rules told George Ritchie that James Ryan and George Lloyd were looking through the scrub for timber, although Ritchie did not see either men. It was at this point, on December 10th, that the inspector arrived at the Camel Station to conduct some inquiries before leaving the following day. In the late afternoon of Christmas Eve, Arthur Upfield and the North Boundary rider Lance Madison left the Camel Station for you and me to buy a sucking pig and a bottle of beer, and much to their surprise, when they arrived, Snowy Rolls was standing on the front steps of the You and Me hotel. Upon speaking to Snowy, he told the Jewel that he, Ryan, and Lloyd had reached Mount Magnet, but that James Ryan decided to stay put. Snowy told Arthur and Lance that James Ryan had let him borrow his truck over Christmas at the time. This didn't strike Upfield or Madison as odd. However, with that being said, later on, Snowy apparently told another colleague that he had bought the truck for £80, contradicting his story. Interestingly, when the inspector returned to Murch a short time later, he spoke to Upfield and mentioned something rather interesting. He told Arthur that a man named Jack Lemon, who had taken Snowy's place at Nari, revealed that his best friend, Leslie George Brown, more commonly known as Louis Corinne, left his job at the adjoining Ouija station in May 1930, but the 28-year-old French-Canadian New Zealander seemingly vanished into thin air. Jack Lemon, who actually arrived in Australia on the same boat as Corinne, was told by Louis that he would write to him about finding a job, but he never did. What was extremely suspicious about Lou Corinne's disappearance was the fact he was last seen leaving the Etnardi station with none other than Snowy Rolls. Louis, who had only been in Australia for a few years by this point, often communicated with his friends and family back in New Zealand, so they started to become concerned after nobody had heard from him in a while. In early 1931, of Corinne's, his friends sent Snowy Rolls a reply-paid telegram at the You and Me hotel in regards to his friend's whereabouts, but Snowy didn't reply. It was at this point that police began investigating Louis Corinne's disappearance, and it came to their attention that James Ryan and George Lloyd were also missing. and had been for some time just as a footnote. It wasn't unusual for these bushmen to be away for long periods of time, especially considering how vast the Australian outback is, and because of this nobody reported the men missing. Authorities, however, were quickly able to establish that both parties were last seen in the company of Snowy Rolls. During the search for Louis Karen, James Ryan, and George Lloyd, a number of extinguished campfires were discovered near the 183-mile hut nicknamed the Haunted Hut along the rabbit-proof fence, and while sifting through the ashes of these fires, authorities discovered a number of small bones, remnants of clothing, a Hong Kong coin, a button, metal shop eyelets, a tooth dentures, and a wedding ring. The ring had a distinguishing mark on it, made by a jeweler who had mended it in Auckland, New Zealand, and this positive identification, along with confirmation from the victim's wife and a dentist who examined the victim's teeth and dentures, police were finally able to identify the victim as Lou Karen. Police soon realized something else, which sent chills down their spines, that the murders had been entirely outlined in Upfield's book. The Sands of Wendy pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together after initially suspecting Arthur Upfield and George Ritchie of being responsible for the murder of Lou Karen. Upfield recounted the night of October 6th to authorities when a small group of men gathered in the homestead of the Camel Station, and Arthur spoke about the trouble he was having with writing the murder plot in his novel. Sitting in the corner of the room listening in was the camp's new arrival, Snowy Rolls. It was at this point that Detective Sergeant Harry Manning, who was leading the case into the three men's disappearances, arrested Snowy Rolls, although they knew him by his real name, John Thomas Smith. He had previously been imprisoned for burglary offenses. However, he escaped and went on the run after managing to send Snowy back to prison. In regards to his escape, police searched through his possessions and found a number of items which had belonged to Lou Karen, including a watch. Police also searched Snowy's ute, which had previously belonged to James Ryan, and lying inside was yet another watch belonging to Lou Karen, both of which had been to the same jewelers in Perth. Some damning evidence which also arose during their investigations was the fact that Snowy had cashed in Lou Karen's paycheck before buying some beer in Painesville, a mining town situated east of Mount Magnet. Australian police now had no doubt in their minds that they had finally caught their killer. When it came to motive, Snowy Rolls, like a lot of men, was tired of working on the rabbit-proof fence and desired to start his own business. But to do so, he needed money and a car, and would have done anything to get them. And he did after managing to carry out the murders of his colleagues. RS managed to obtain James Ryan's car and Lou Karen's paycheck. It appeared that Snowy was Dr. Jackal and Mr. Hyde kind of character, and was very different to the man who first showed up at the Camel Station. Nobody thought for a second that such a charming individual could be capable of murder. Evidence was produced at Snowy's trial before Mr. Justice Draper and a jury. This evidence given was in regards to Snowy's behavior, his knowledge about the murder plot in Arthur Upfield novel, and the fact that he had told authorities a number of lies in regards to his movements. Arthur Upfield gave evidence as a witness and quoted in his book regarding the outcome of the trial. Fate summer was nearly over, and for you, Snowy, alas, the winter has come. Despite the vast amount of evidence presented to the court, Snowy continued to proclaim his innocence, and his defense claimed the evidence against him was purely circumstantial, but that the jury didn't buy it. After one of the most dramatic criminal trials in Perth as history, the jury found John Thomas Smith, also known as Snowy Rolls, guilty of murdering Louis Carême after just 2 hours of deliberations, and as a result of his heinous crimes, the judge sentenced Snowy Rolls to hang by the noose until he was dead. Both James Ryan and George Lloyd's bodies were never covered, however. It is presumed that Snowy killed them following the method used in Arthur Upfield novel. The Sands of Wendy therefore committed to the so-called perfect murder, as no trace of either men could be found, and in doing so, there was no physical evidence which could be used in court. It is interesting to note, however, that pieces of an accordion were found in one of the fires, and George Lloyd played the accordion. It was due to Snowy's mistakes in disposing of Lou Carême's body that led to his downfall out of the list of steps that George Ritchie had come up with for Upfield murder plot. Snowy forgot to sift for the metals and dissolved them in acid, therefore left traces of Lou Carême's tooth and wedding ring in the ashes of the fires. There was little doubt in the jury's mind that Rolls had indeed killed Lou Carême, as well as Ryan and Lloyd, quite interestingly days before he was due to be executed. Snowy Rolls made a statement in which he claimed that whilst traveling from Painesville towards his camp, he found that Louis Carême had accidentally poisoned himself with butter baits used for foxes. According to Snowy, he burned the body so that he wouldn't have to report it to the police, because of course he was already on the run. For from jail, if he went to the police, he would be captured and sent back to prison. His claims did not add up in regards to the distances he would have needed to travel, and therefore his statement made no difference in regards to his sentence after several failed appeals. In regards to his fate, Snowy Rolls was hanged on the 13th of June 1932 at Fremantle Jail without making any confessions as a result of widespread media attention in this case. Arthur Upfield novel, The Sands of Wendy, became a bestseller and a fitting conclusion to Arthur Upfield novel regarding the Murchison murders and Snowy Rolls. He said, quote, "Thus passed out a strangely stormy spirit, his life before him favored by the gods, with a fine physique and good looks. He could have risen high in this country, impelled upwards by the personality of his Dr. Jekyll, but the secret devil in all of us, the Mr. Hyde, was too powerful for Snowy Rolls."